Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. Today is the day that much of America has been anticipating with dread, longing, hope, one of those, for years now. It is Election Day. Now, over the last 20 plus weeks, I have been making the case for why anyone, but especially Christians, should consider not participating in the election at all. But even if you found my arguments so far meaningful, there's still one major issue that I thought would be important to address before the election finally hits. Is abstention from voting doing violence to the oppressed in refusing to help them? Now, this is really a similar question to one that I addressed early on in the very first season. I think it was episode 7. And that was related to nonviolence when we asked the question of whether refusing to violently intervene and prevent harm to somebody was equivalent to doing evil. You know, James says that if you don't do good, if you refuse to do good, then it's sin, right? There's sins of omission, refusing to do good. So if refusing to help somebody through violence is doing evil by abstaining from an action, then you could kind of say the same thing about voting. Like, is not voting, is that participating in an evil through a sin of omission? For this episode, I wanted to get Aree Spivey back on the show, who is somebody that I talked to in Season 9 on government. And I wanted to have a more in-depth discussion on this topic because I think that hearing from someone who isn't in the majority, who isn't a WASP like me, I think that's really the best. Unfortunately, I couldn't get that set up, so I am going to replay an earlier discussion with him where we address the issue of whether or not abstention fails to do good towards those who are oppressed. Now, I'm not going to play the whole episode. I'm just going to play a clip from that. But you can go back to Season 9 and find my interview with Aree if you'd like the whole thing. The clip is a relatively short one compared to our other episodes, but it's jam-packed with a number of different points that he makes. And I'm also going to have a longer introduction to it today. So I want to highlight those points before playing the clip so that when you listen to it, you know what to look out for. So in this clip that I'm going to play, Aree is going to use an analogy that I think works really well. He talks about government, legislation, action, all that entails. He talks about how that is really a gun that is being wielded, metaphorically, and literally, because, governments control the armies and the police forces, right? The goal of voting is to essentially grab this gun and to take control of it ourselves. And then we force that on others through legislation. So that might seem like a really good idea, right? Because we all think that we in our group are benevolent and we think that we will use this gun for the good. But there are a number of issues that Aree identifies with this. First, we're using the same gun that was used for evil, right? We're legitimizing the use of this weapon that we know has been used and is being used for great evil. And in fact, many minorities today still think that the nation, the United States, is populated with menacing racists. By legitimizing the gun and perpetuating the power of this gun that is still wielded for evil and trying to grasp it ourselves, we end up not only becoming morally complicit with the evil that's continuing, but we end up propping the system of evil, legitimizing it. And even if we do wrest the gun away for a period of time, we end up perpetuating it so that it can be grabbed by evil men and women again in the future. Or it can turn our own hearts evil, because we so often haughtily assume that we ourselves won't use the gun for evil or be corrupted by it. Now that might all seem like a smug, idealistic approach, right? Well, if you can't do it perfectly, then don't do it, right? That sounds like what I'm advocating here. I'd argue that it's really probably more like telling an alcoholic not to go into a bar, right? If they're trying to get off of alcohol, like, you wouldn't send them into that situation. Well, history shows us the human heart and our addiction to power and the way that it leads us to violence. So I would argue that it's much more like that than it is smug idealism. Nevertheless, simply refusing to use the gun ourselves isn't going to make the gun go away, right? It's still going to be wielded against somebody even if I choose not to pick it up. But the question is then, will our promotion of the gun and our use of it really make the world a better place? I mean, CRT, a view which is strongly opposed to minority oppression and racism, it recognizes that the gun, it persists, and it's continually pointed towards the oppressed, no matter what. We discussed this earlier in the season, that racism and injustice, they don't go away. They just get morphed into different forms. Slavery became convict leasing, sharecropping, debt peonage, Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration. It just continues. Those in 1865 thought that by grabbing the gun, they were making the world a better place, a place without ironclad slavery. And in one sense, they did create that. Yet slavery persisted in other forms. But now it was just a more nebulous and out-of-sight form, harder to put one's finger on and to dismantle. Arguably, what improvements we have made in the U.S. in dismantling slavery only came because we then figured out how to export our oppression, or morph it. Because it was only a few decades after the Civil War when the United States began to expand its territories and influence, beginning with Hawaii, then Cuba, and the DR, the Philippines, and South and Central America. In the 20th century, the U.S. was directly and indirectly responsible for exporting more violence on more bodies than all of the slaves ever held in U.S. captivity. And the U.S. continues this violence not only through wars, but through slave labor and debt peonage of other nations. We have exported our slavery and violence to compensate for the labor that we lost after the emancipation of the enslaved here in the States. In essence, then, this gun that we have been grasping at has not only failed to advance justice in our nation as far as it seems to have advanced it on the surface, but wherever we do see more justice, we can find exported injustice that compensates this. Injustice is lucrative, which is why everyone wants to control the gun. And when one does get a hold of the gun, they declare that justice is finally served because they're no longer oppressed. So long as their oppression ceases, so long as they have power, they're conveniently blinded to the injustice being done towards others, this shifting and morphing of injustice. This all reminds me a little bit of the life of Frederick Douglass, someone that we've talked a little bit about on the show. I have a work by him read in our Great Work series in which Douglass espouses a pacifistic stance towards resolving the travesty of enslavement. Douglass had initially held on to this pacifistic stance as conveyed to him through William Lloyd Garrison. But it didn't take too long for Douglass to throw off this seemingly naive idea to embrace a more realistic, so he thought, and more practical position, right? Using politics, grasping at the gun, grasping at violence in order to accomplish what was good. And isn't that what politics is? Grasping at the gun and using violence to accomplish what one believes is good, however one defines that. Well, Douglass's stance, it seemed to pay off because the enslaved in the States were freed through violence. We can forget that most of the rest of the world freed the enslaved without violence, right? But in the States, it came through violence. Douglass succeeded. His group succeeded. And Douglass's new ideology prevailed. He snatched the gun from the enslavers and the racists, and he turned it back on them. Now, fast forward a few decades, though, from the Civil War, and as I elaborated on in our episode on Haiti, Frederick Douglass gained a position of power. He became an ambassador to Haiti. He had a chance to expand U.S. influence in the world as well as represent being a black man in a position of power. And he had a chance to work to better a society that was built by the formerly enslaved, the Haitian society, a people with whom Douglass felt perhaps more kinship than with those in the States, or maybe at least as much, I don't know. But what ends up happening to Douglass as he continues to hold the gun of political power and imperial might? What transpires? Well, he's forced to aim that gun at the formerly enslaved and the still oppressed people of Haiti. And he's forced to do it at the behest of former slaveholders and current racists for their benefit. Because Douglas is a man of great integrity, though, he ends up dropping the gun very quickly, as big business and big government oust him from his position as ambassador. And as far as I'm aware, Douglas didn't give up on trying to get a hold of the gun again. He still advocated grabbing that gun. He spoke out vocally for the up-and-coming women's suffrage movement, and talked about the importance of people voting and getting into politics. So Douglas didn't think, even after his experience in Haiti, he didn't think that the problem was the gun. Rather, that the bad people still held the gun. All in all, though, I think Douglas's story is extremely informative for us here. Do I think the gun in the hands of Douglas would have done less harm and more good than the gun wielded by aristocratic imperial racists? Yeah, definitely. But what we see in the case of Douglas is that the gun is always aimed somewhere. For hundreds of years, that gun was aimed at black and brown bodies here in the U.S., and to a certain extent, it still is, just in different forms. But as the story of Frederick Douglass shows, it's easy for those who grab the gun to purposefully or ignorantly overlook where the gun ends up getting pointed, once it's no longer pointed at them. In fact, it became easy for the oppressed to become the oppressors. Douglas may have been unwilling to turn the gun on a people who were so clearly being exploited, but I would argue that Douglas is the exception and not the rule. In the world of politics and power, it's the exceptions, not the rules, that are made to be broken. One of those exceptions that was broken was Martin Luther King Jr. He sought power in order to liberate, and when he felt liberation stirring in the air, he refused to be satisfied with liberation for his people alone. Yes, civil rights for the black community was a central struggle for Dr. King, but in uncovering injustice against his own community, he also uncovered injustice in the broader nation and the globe. On April 4th, 1967, MLK extended his look beyond his own black community to the rest of the nation and the world with his famous Beyond Vietnam speech, in which he addressed not just racism against his own group, but social injustice against the poor in general and militarism against the developing world at large. Now, coincidentally, King was assassinated exactly a year to the date from making this speech, and just a month before the Poor People's March on Washington was scheduled to take place. Those seeking power for themselves or their group alone might be a thorn in the side of power, but sometimes, if they're placated enough, they're allowed to hold and help aim the gun so that they might be appeased. But when those like Dr. King or Frederick Douglass try to wield the gun for true, broad-ranging justice, they can't be tolerated. They have to be broken. And that, in my opinion, is exactly why King was broken. It's why his memory is not about him being somebody who advocated against militarism and poverty, but somebody who's solely focused on race. There's a wonderful quote that I think sums this up, this trivium here of militarism, racism, and injustice towards the poor. I think it sums it up really well. It's a book entitled What is Property? And it's by this guy, and I'm going to say it incorrectly, but Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. And I just want you to listen to what he says. He's talking about Rome here, and this idea of bread and circuses, which is the leaders. How do they appease people? They provide them their daily bread, their needs, make sure those are provided for, and or they provide them with distractions, with entertainment. And so as long as you can keep the people appeased through distraction and necessity, then you can kind of control people. And so here's what he says, quote, "If the people, out of respect for legality, took this beautiful advice, the Senate conjured up a difficulty. The reform was postponed, and that was the end of it. On the contrary, if the demands of the proletariat became too pressing, it declared a foreign war, and neighboring nations were deprived of their liberty to maintain the Roman aristocracy. But the toils of war were only a halt for the plebeians in their onward march toward pauperism. The lands confiscated from the conquered nations were immediately added to the domain of the state, to the ager publicus, and as such, cultivated for the benefit of the treasury, or, as was more often the case, they were sold at auction. None of them were granted to the proletariats, who, unlike the patricians and knights, were not supplied by the victory with the means of buying them. War never enriched the soldier. The extensive plundering has been done always by the generals. End quote. So what do you do when there's civil unrest? What did Rome do? Well, they tried to sweet talk the plebeians. They tried to sweet talk the lower classes and make sure everything was okay. And as long as they were able to appease them through, minor discussions or appeasement, great. But if they couldn't provide what they needed in order to be appeased, what did they do? They declared war. And they were able to get wealth and distractions, and they were able to satiate the upper classes through newly acquired wealth that they extracted from other nations. That is the story of the United States, and especially in the last century and a half. Really, its whole existence. But it's not just the United States. I mean, that's empire. That's par for the course for politics, right? It's just that a lot of countries don't ever get to be the big man on campus. They don't get to be the top dog, right? But everybody would do it if they had the opportunity. And so that's what we're really talking about here today. This is what the gun is. King, he was broken. He was killed because he put these puzzle pieces together, right? He recognized the relationship between the gun and where it gets pointed, and all of these the poverty, the militarism, and the racism. In this episode, then, we are going to hear Aree talk about this metaphorical gun that he doesn't think we should grab at, even at the promise that with it, we might be able to do great good. And that's because Aree knows how politics works. And he knows history, a small portion of which I just touched on here, and much more which I've discussed throughout the seasons. As you think about voting today or in the future, I challenge you to think about the gun that you are considering aiming. If you vote, who will you be pointing the gun at? And who are you giving the power to pull the trigger? Of course, we're finishing up a season on abstention from voting here, so you know my position. Don't point the gun at anyone. Don't justify the pulling of a trigger. Don't legitimize the violence and oppression that wielding the gun brings. And don't justify your actions out of convenience, rationalizing injustice because at least you and your group won't be harmed any longer. So that's enough for now. Here it is, the last word as brought to you by Aree Spivey. Last question here. I haven't seen very many black anarchists. I'm sure they exist. And so I don't know all the reasons for that, but the sense that I have is that, you hear a lot of black people talking, and in terms of politics, they talk about how, like anarchism or non-participation, if I'm going to refuse to vote, because I just don't like any of the candidates, a lot of them will say, well, that's a privilege that you have because there's nothing that really, really impacts you that much. And so it's hard for me to really speak into that because, I understand if my group was oppressed for a long, long time and there's still hangovers of that and still effects and impacts and still legislation and the justice system and all that kind of stuff, it's easy for me to say, I'm just not going to participate. But, I've heard a lot of black political activists saying that's irresponsible and that's unjust to refuse participation to help. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you've probably dealt with a whole lot more pushback from people, but I'd love I'd love to know, have you heard those accusations? And then secondly, how do you respond to that?
Um, well, I guess I would. I mean, that's kind of the reason why I cited. Well, I didn't cite. I just basically brought up Walter E. Williams, Thomas Sowell, all of those black intellectuals who they're not liberal and they're not progressive and they don't necessarily buy into the idea that I guess um, racism is so detrimental to black people nowadays. And for me, I wouldn't deny the idea that systemic racism exists. I wouldn't deny the idea that um, I guess that racism is a bad thing and that um, racism has harmed and has done systematic harm to black people and maybe even now. I'm more so of a person who thinks that you just have to deal with the fact that racism isn't going anywhere. One, two, deal with the fact that I think that black society, that the black culture, and especially for me, just as a black man, we can do so much more to contribute to our own well being than what a lot of these activists tend to say that we can. Because they attribute so much of it to the inequities that are caused by racism and things like that. I think for me, um, I don't see any solutions to, um, I guess, basically engaging in politics at all because I feel like I've gotten a good enough history lesson from what the government has done to people that look like me that turns me off to ever thinking that course of action like voting and being in politics, it's just scarred me too much to ever think that I would ever need to utilize that path towards, I guess, liberation. And so for me, I look at government I look at government as fundamentally a gun, which is fundamentally what it is. And looking at what, my grandmother, she grew up in the 50s. She was born in the 50s. So she went and experienced Jim Crow, right? So it's not like I'm completely turned off to the idea that racism is horrible. My grandmother is still alive. Jim Crow wasn't that long ago. I mean, just looking at the span of how long America has been here. So I wholly understand that um, there are still racial inequities that occur in this country. That there's still things that can be done and that can be improved. I just don't think that utilizing the same gun that was used to oppress us in the past is a good enough solution because you still have there's the gun is still there. Like who's to say? Because when it comes to these kinds of people, they'll say that um, the culture is still systemically racist. So they're saying that there's still a bulk of the American populace that's still racist. And they'll say, hey, politicians, police officers, there's still a lot of them who are still benefiting from and even perpetuating the idea that America is systemically racist. Why would I want to give them the gun to potentially do what you say it's doing again? So for me, I'm more so of a person who I think I just think my salute, not necessarily my solution, but my position, whether it be whether it be a passive solution or whether it be a passive position or not, I just think that my position in the end will cause less harm than their positions will. Because either way it goes, you acknowledge that the government has done and perpetuated all of these inequities and have perpetuated all of these tyrannical things on us. And then you say, out the other side of your mouth, you say, all right, let's take that same gun and make with it what we do. I mean, make with it what we would want to happen. But then you simultaneously say we're still dealing with a systemically racist society, and all of our institutions still involve racism. And I just don't find that to be a very smart move. Why would you continue to legitimize the institutions that once oppressed you, and you still say the same people that are currently involved in these institutions right now are still occupying these positions, and they still have the same sentiments to a certain extent as those people did back in the day? I don't see any reason or any justification to then say we should still legitimize the same institutions, because of, if you don't, you're giving power to the oppressors again. It's like, well, either way it goes, they still have the power whether or not. So for me, I just say I would say the idea that, I guess, being passive about politics is irresponsible. I think utilizing the gun that was used to oppress you, and you are still sitting by the same people that you claim are oppressing you when they could potentially get the gun again. I think that's more irresponsible, because that could lead to more tyrannical practices in the future. So it's a very complicated issue, but I think my position makes a little bit more sense than the position that they're prodding out. And obviously, there's been people who have come up to me, and I'll tell them straight up, I don't vote. I never will. I think that signals that you're legitimizing the organization that was used to, that oppressed us in the past. And they'll say, "Yo, well, we need it. It's necessary because of this or that and this or that." And it's like, I just can't get past the idea that I'm basically getting in the same car that all of these, and getting in the same car and potentially, that's a bad analogy, but using the same gun, I guess, to get what I think get needs to be done, and potentially the next year, the people that I claim to be my oppressors can get the gun back. So I think my solution would be is to just do away with the gun. You know, just do away with the gun, and you won't have that, because I think that a racist person without the state, I just think is just, I think he's powerless, honestly. So if you have a racist person with the state, that's potentially that's potentially genocide. A racist person without the state, that's just a racist person with bad ideas.
Yeah, no,
And I'm not afraid of a racist person. I'm afraid of a racist person with a badge on them. I'm not afraid of a racist person who's just sitting there. So what? So I think it's just bad. It's bad. It's a bad way to live, to think that the same the same institution that was used to oppress you, that you could potentially use it in a good way. I just don't think it's plausible. And I think when you look at the history of the way that governments tend to do, they tend to become oppressive, and they tend to become and descend into tyranny. And on top of that, so with that, and then on top of the fact that racism was literally um, perpetuated by the government, I just find it extremely irrational to ever believe that it would be okay to participate in the political system.
yeah, I like those analogies, and talking about the harm an individual can do versus the harm that a group with power can do. And it also reminds me a lot of CRT. I think it's a shame that there are so many people in some of the groups that we run in, but then also, the conservatives who supposedly want to limit the state. They're very anti-CRT, and I'm like, you guys are crazy. You should be all about CRT, because not only does it make accurate observations, okay, I don't like their solutions, which is why I think so many people don't like CRT, because it basically wants government to do stuff. But its observations are spot on. It's exactly what you just said. It says, hey, look, government says that they fix our problems with legislation, but what they really do is they shift the problem to somewhere else. Okay, they got rid of slavery. No, there's debt peonage and there's sharecropping. It's really slavery. Okay, well they give minorities the right to vote. Yeah, but then they disenfranchise them through the war on drugs, right? Well, CRT makes all those observations, and they essentially say the government's worthless. It doesn't fix the problems. But then CRT goes on to say, so let's use the government to fix this problem. So I think your observations are spot on. I think it's exactly what CRT observes. It's just your solution is a far better one than CRT proposes.
Yeah, and because honestly, I think I would fundamentally agree with, because okay, when it comes to me, like I think I think white liberals, in my opinion, because honestly, I'm literally not a political person. I mean, I have political views, but I don't follow politics that much. It just it doesn't. I have no idea what President Biden is doing right now. I don't know, and I just never will, and I don't care. So but for me, I think that one of the things that has just made at least black people's predicament even worse is the fact that I honestly do believe that if white people had not necessarily decided to help us, I'm more of a Malcolm X kind of guy than a Martin Luther King kind of guy. I'm more of a person who would say, not necessarily not necessarily in a defensive phraseology, but I'm more of a person who say, look, people racists out there don't care. Do whatever you need to do. If you want to be racist, go be racist over there. I don't need you. I don't need your help. When it comes to people who claim that they need my help, I don't need your help. I can do it myself. You know, you guys have helped enough. You're obviously your solutions obviously aren't helping. Like for me, it's always been, and I guess this is why I don't necessarily refer to myself as a liberal or a progressive, because I think I almost cringe when I see, and not necessarily saying it's a bad thing, but I almost cringe when I see white people trying to like almost defend us, you know? Not necessarily saying it's a bad thing. I don't get mad, but it's more so of a realization that when white liberals in particular and white progressives have like attempted to help us in the past, it's all that is done is make it worse, you know? And for me, when I hear stuff like that, like, yo, hey, look, we have white privilege or we do whatever. And I acknowledge that white privilege exists. I don't care. It's not really a big thing for me. But one of the things that make it difficult for me to get on board with the idea, specifically like, okay, with CRT, fine. They make a lot of valid observations about the world and about what the government, what solutions may be the best solution for us. And it's like, okay, you guys have been doing this for so long and it doesn't work because fundamentally I guess your argumentation is proper, but your statism is getting in the way and it's hurting us. So for me, I can't even stomach the idea of, like, specifically like white liberals trying to, I guess, help me and help us, because I just see that it doesn't actually help anything. It really doesn't help anything. And so this is fundamentally the reason why I'll say, hey, I think the solution is put down the gun that was used to oppress us, and let's work on it ourselves. Because if what you guys are saying, basically that, you know, that the white population, they fundamentally don't care about where we are, and and they're benefiting from this system and whatnot. It's like, okay, fine, let's just say that that's true. I don't think it's true. I think the majority of white people in this country are, are cool. I don't think most people have, negative views about me just because of my skin color. I think most white people are lovable people. But for me, if you're going to take the idea that, that we live in a society that oppresses us because of our skin color, I don't see why you would want to exercise your right to vote when you have a populace that is what, almost 70% white. But you also say the vast majority of them are racist, or they benefit from a society, they benefit from a system that is racist, and they don't want to give up their privileges. It's like, okay, all of that has been, all of the arguments that you use to make that case, like 80-90% of the time, government's behind it. Like, whether it's redlining, whether it's Jim Crow, it doesn't matter, just name it. All of that stuff fundamentally comes from the fact that whites in the past utilized the government to bark up more inequities and inequalities, right? So it's like, I just don't get, why do you insist on utilizing the state institution when, one, what it does, what it could potentially do to us, and two, for a fact that the vast majority of people in this country are white, and you also say we live in a systemic society and they benefit off of this, benefit off of the racism. What do you expect is going to be the result of that type of stuff? I just literally don't get why more black people aren't at least at minimum libertarians, and at maximum anarchists. I just don't get it, because I think the logical conclusion to looking at the history of what Black America has gone, well, Black society, Black culture has, not Black culture, but Black people have gone through in this country, is anarchism. I say throw away the whole thing, and let's see if we can get it out the mud and do it ourselves, because I don't see the government shrinking. I see the government becoming more overreaching, and I think it inevitably could potentially go back into where it was, and that is oppressing minorities, because that's kind of what you guys already say anyway. That's what you're supposing anyway. That's why you don't want Republicans and conservatives in office, because you think it is going to lead to the oppression of minorities. Why do you continue to subsidize and legitimize this particular institution that you think is going to, could potentially oppress us again? I don't see why you just don't do away with it.
Well,
Just throw it away.
That's exactly what a democracy is. It's the oppression of a minority by a majority, or
Very
maybe
much so.
oppression's a harsh word sometimes, but I mean, sometimes it literally is, like you said. Well, I've got kiddos who woke up, and I would love to continue, but I enjoyed it. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. I ramble. I should have warned you before we even started. I ramble a lot.
Well, I invited you. This is about you getting to share your thoughts. So whatever you shared was fantastic, and we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, I look forward to it.
All right. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day.
Yes, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.